I want to start really with acknowledging these are some of the people who I'm currently working with, have worked with, continue to work with, will work with, who either I've stolen ideas from or who've worked very hard and I've taken all the credit. So this is one of the only opportunities to actually acknowledge some of those people in the room, to acknowledge the hard work, and the fact that I'm stood up here talking reflects the fact that I have an incredible team that I work with who make all of the work that we do possible. Some are PhD students, some other academics like Anne and Michael, some are colleagues from other universities, particularly the Anna Freud Centre, and some are colleagues from overseas. And a very important person in my professional life who's Peter Farrell, who sadly is no longer with us. He's not dead, he retired, but he lives in Marple, he's fine. But he was an incredible, I think, to get to the stage of the career that I've kind of got to and am kind of hopefully continuing in a good direction. I think you can't do that without an incredible mentor, and Peter took me under his wing in 2002 when I joined, and I definitely wouldn't be standing talking to you today if I'd not had that kind of mentorship from him, so I'm very grateful for that. Okay, so some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight. So, how rats look after their young. We're going to talk a little bit about Humpty Dumpty. We're going to talk about Winnie the Pooh. We're going to talk about Bart Simpson. We're going to talk about Inside Out. And we're going to talk about something called Penny Dreadfuls. All of that, I promise, or I hope, will make sense by the end of the talk. Other things that I'll talk about in between those things. What do we mean when we talk about mental health? I don't think that is at all clear. Are mental health problems increasing? There is a popular perception that they are among children and young people, so I'm going to take a look at some of the evidence around that. How education and mental health have become linked at a policy level and why that may be the case. Whether there's a crisis. There's a lot of talk of a crisis in children's mental health, and it's, as I'll show you later on, pretty much not a week goes by without media referring to newspapers, television reports referring to a crisis in CAMHS, a crisis in children's mental health. Why schools have become a particular focus in this area. Whether evidence-based practices, as they're referred to, or evidence-based interventions are the answer, and I'm going to take a particularly kind of critical look at that. And then also whether all of this is a load of hogwash and whether this is just an example of a generational child panic. So there is a view in certain circles in academia that all of this talk of mental health difficulties increasing and a crisis in mental health is just this generation's child panic, and I'll talk you through some of the evidence of previous child panics, and we can see, it'll be up to you to decide what you feel is actually going on here. Okay, so I wanted to start with a little tale about rats. So forgive me, we are talking about children and young people tonight, and I know children and young people, science has definitively shown us that children are different from rats, but I promise this will hopefully make sense. This is, there's a field of study called behavioural epigenetics. So this is basically about how our environment influences activation of genes that influence our behaviour. So years ago, the assumption was whatever you get in terms of your genetics, that's it and you're stuck with. And to a certain extent that's true, but actually it's only half the picture. What happens to us, and particularly what happens to us during childhood, actually influences whether certain genes are activated and therefore influence our behaviour. So there's a study by Weaver and colleagues which was groundbreaking at the time. They were interested in how rats care for their young, and they looked at two things in rats. They looked at maternal licking. So in the rat population, some of the rat mums lick their pups a lot, some lick them a moderate amount and some lick them a little bit. And they also looked at archback nursing, which is when the mum is feeding the pups, they kind of envelop them, they kind of curve their bodies around them, and it makes them feel safe and it makes them feel warm. And what these researchers were able to show with their study of rats, they did something called cross-fostering. So what that involves is you're a high licker, so we take your pups and we cross-foster them to Helen, who's a low licker, and we take some of your pups and we cross-foster them with Ruth, who's a moderate licker. So they swap them around. You can see now why we don't do this with kids. So they do that, and then they look at, well, what happens later in life? And what they were able to show, and they then put the rats up and look at various things, again, this is why we can't do it with kids. What they were able to show with that is that that nurturing behaviour, and it serves no other purpose other than to make those rat pups feel safe, feel calm, feel, you know, feel warm. It serves no other purpose than that. That behaviour influences the activation of genes that are responsible for how we respond to stress through the lifespan. So they are able to show this with a population of rats by doing a study which we could never do with children. But the moral for me is that what that shows us, and there is work on behavioural epigenetics in children, they just use different methodologies, but what it shows us is during those formative years, during childhood, during adolescence, we've always felt intuitively that it's important to have a nurturing, or some of us have felt it's important to have a very nurturing foundation characterised by care. What we now know from behavioural epigenetics is exactly why that's so important, that it's actually altering the way in which we develop from the inside out. So that's the kind of starting point for me. This is not a critical period, and there's work on behavioural epigenetics that shows that actually even in environments where that's not been in place in the early years, there's still things you can do about it, but it shows just how important those formative years are. Okay, some foundations then. These are the people and the models who are kind of key influences in what I'm going to talk to you about, and people whose work has influenced my own. So I'm going to start with John Bowlby, who people will recognise as the father of attachment theory. I don't think you can talk about mental health without talking about attachment theory. Essentially, what Bowlby brings to this area is this idea of connections between people. So attachment theory is all about connections between infant and caregiver, or primarily between infant and caregiver, but actually attachment theory has been applied in lots of other contexts, and it's fundamentally about connections between people, about bonds between people that serve the purpose of improving our mental health. So Bowlby brings that. Yuri Bronfenbrenner developed ecological systems theory. This is the most powerful influence on my thinking at the moment, and it's really about, and hopefully it's reflected in what follows tonight, the idea that there is no single thing that we can talk about. There's no single influence. I'm not here to say to you, this is what causes mental health problems and this is what we do about. What Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory shows is that if you want to understand any aspect of development, you've got to be looking at a wide range of influences in a wide range of contexts. So he talks about the microsystem context of the classroom and of the peer group, talks about the broader societal and community influences, and talks even about where we are historically. So he talks about the chronosystem. Childhood in 2016 is different to childhood in 1895. The idea of childhood has changed over time, so you can't understand development, Bronfenbrenner said, without also considering the historical context, where we are now compared to where we were 50, 100, 200 years ago. Other key people are Michael Rutter. So Michael Rutter is the key person who started work around this notion of risk and resilience in child mental health with some groundbreaking studies, and particularly the idea of cumulative risk, which I'm going to come back to. Anne Maston, anybody that's done any work on the idea of resilience among children and young people will be familiar with Maston. She's a kind of, the person in the field, the kind of landmark person whose ideas are in pretty much every paper, every book that's been written on the concept of resilience. What she brings is a really simple message. So her work talks about this idea of resilience as ordinary magic. So when we look at what makes children and young people resilient, even when they're experiencing significant adversity, her view, and there's a lot of research to support her view, is that it arises from ordinary resources and processes. It's not rocket science, is basically her view. The things that help children lead the kinds of lives that are positive and free from mental health problems are basic things like relationships with a caring adult. So there is nothing complex or complicated, or these are all basic kind of human kind of interactions she feels are the important resources to make children and young people resilient. And then finally, somebody that I've had the pleasure and honour to work with recently, a guy called Michael Ungar, who's also a resilience researcher, who talked about the idea of social ecology of risk and resilience, and the fact that we have to understand cultural variation. So what risk and resilience means in Western culture, for example, isn't necessarily the same as what it means in Eastern cultures and in other cultures. So the cultural context is key. He also talked about this idea of equifinality, which is really just a shorthand way of saying there are multiple routes to bad outcomes and there are multiple routes to good outcomes. And again, we shouldn't be talking about one thing causing mental health difficulties, and similarly, there isn't just one way to intervene. So those are my kind of foundations. Okay, so Humpty Dumpty. So what do we mean when we talk about mental health? This is from Through the Looking Glass. There's a film made of this last year or this year. It's rubbish, don't watch it. Watched it with my daughter at the weekend and we were both falling asleep. Johnny Depp wandering around just looking a bit weird. It was awful. However, there's a really salient kind of passage in Through the Looking Glass which is about, it's playing on the idea that actually words only mean what we intend them to mean, and we can never quite know what somebody else meant when they used a particular word. And so Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more or less. That's really, I think, in a nutshell, encapsulates the issue when we start to think about what we mean when we talk about mental health. So as a thought exercise, so this is not audience participation, unless you want it to be, I want you to start to think about that. L should be on the other line, so it should say mental. What comes to mind when you see, I should have checked the slides before I did them. What comes to mind when you see the word mental? Does anything change when the word health comes after it? Does anything change when the word illness comes after it? Does mental health and mental illness, how related are they? Are they the same thing? Is it two sides of the same coin? Are they distinct from one another? What about mental health difficulties? Is that more or less acceptable than the use of the word mental illness? Does it change the way you think about what those words mean? What about if we throw well-being in? So mental well-being, does that mean anything? Does it mean something different from mental health? What about now? So emotional well-being, which is very popular in the kind of in the schools-based literature. Is that a more acceptable way of describing this kind of general area than mental health? Probably you've each got different ideas as we've gone through those words. The interpretation of them, there's no single definition, there's no single agreed upon approach to what these words mean and how they relate to one another. What tends to happen in the field, in the research field, is people use them a bit interchangeably, and if nobody notices, we just carry on. Or people write really angry articles where they say it's absolutely unacceptable to talk about mental health difficulties, we should just talk about something else instead. But it's just to start there to say that this is something that is at the key of this whole area. If we can't agree on what we're talking about, then we need some progress in that area before we can start to think about what we need to do. It's possible that actually these words are just acceptable, that they're just used in different professional contexts. So schools like this, generally speaking, they like the emotional well-being, that's palatable. But if you talk about mental health difficulties or mental illness particularly, schools don't like it. Other professional contexts, it's part of the professional parlance. So, for example, clinical psychologists, potentially psychiatrists, different professions have these different kind of lexicons, but ultimately we're all pointing in the same direction. Okay. So they work on this, and really there's three camps. There's been a long-standing objection to this idea of the illness framework, that talking about mental health in terms of illness, in the same way that it's the parallel to physical ill health, it's not appropriate to talk about mental health difficulties in the same way that we talk about physical illness. Although actually there's been a backlash against that recently. There's lots of these cartoons and so on. I don't know if you've seen them on the internet and on Facebook and things of, why don't we treat physical health difficulties in the same way we treat mental health difficulties. So there's a picture of somebody who's had their arm cut off, and the person stood next to them says, well, have you tried not bleeding? Because ultimately, when people experience mental health difficulties, that's quite often the reaction that we get. Have you tried getting out of bed? Have you tried moving around a bit? You might feel a little bit less depressed. But ultimately, to somebody who is really severely depressed, that's a nonsense. I don't stay in bed out of day through choice. I stay out in bed because I can't, it's impossible for me as somebody who's clinically depressed to do that. So there's issues there. What we've seen is the emergence of what I've kind of called the enhancement agenda. So it's a kind of a strengths-based discourse that's all about agency, resilience and well-being. So it's about trying to put a positive spin on this. To a degree, I think that's great. The problem with that approach, though, is I think it underplays and sometimes actively ignores the fact that the children and young people who I'll be talking about later are experiencing significant distress. And it brushes that to one side to have essentially a very kind of politically correct approach to talking about what's very serious difficulty in a young person's life. And then finally we have this two-factor model, which is the kind of classic academic compromise where we say, well, actually, it's both and it's neither. So we can talk about mental health as representing experience of symptoms of distress, but we can also talk about it in terms of adaptive functioning, and the two are, you know, essentially parallel continua. They're not kind of opposite ends of the same spectrum. They exist alongside one another. And there's research which I'll tell you a little bit about that actually backs that up. So that's where we are. I'm going to focus primarily on mental health difficulties tonight because I think that's where at the moment, certainly my research has led me, and I think that's where a lot of the media attention is, and a lot of the issues to do with CAMHS and so on in schools has focused on children who experience mental health difficulties. So there's various ways you could do that. The way that I find most useful is to go to the 100-acre wood. So people are familiar with Winnie the Pooh. Okay. I'm acutely familiar with Winnie the Pooh because I have two daughters, and the elder daughter went through the Winnie the Pooh phase, and the younger daughter is currently going through it. So I live and breathe Winnie the Pooh in the 100-acre wood. A researcher called Shea and colleagues wrote a tongue-in-cheek paper about 16 years ago called Psychopathology in the 100-acre wood. And what they've suggested, and I think it's quite a useful tool, is actually each of these characters, if you read A.A. Milne's book and if you watch the cartoons, these are all mental health archetypes. So let's take Tigger. So Tigger is gregarious. He physically bounces everywhere. He's in your face. He is impulsive. So there's a story in one of A.A. Milne's books where he decides it would be a good idea to go and eat and try all the different mushrooms that were growing in the 100-acre wood. He doesn't think about the consequences, he doesn't think about the long term, what the risks might be, he just impulsively does it. So Tigger we might see as a case for hyperactivity, or what some people refer to as ADHD. Eeyore, unfortunately, Eeyore is constantly thinking and talking very negatively, shows signs of low mood, always filters information to get the worst out of it. So he's very much a glasses half empty person, or a very glasses half empty donkey, if such a thing exists. So we might talk about Eeyore in terms of what some people refer to as depression. Pooh Bear possibly has some special educational needs. So if he was seen by a psychologist or a Senko, they might talk in terms of moderate learning difficulties. A.A. Milne referred to Pooh Bear as a bear of very little brain, which I think is quite harsh, but it's okay because he's fictional. But also Pooh Bear shows some obsessive compulsive patterns in his behaviour. So if you read the books and the cartoons, he's constantly counting his honey jars, he's constantly arranging them. When he's not actually in the room where the honey jars are, he's wanting to go back and check that they're okay. So some of that might be seen as an obsessive compulsive pattern. Rabbit. So Rabbit, all the signs that you see in the 100-acre wood, and they're usually spelt wrong, Rabbit did those apparently. This is part of the kind of 100-acre wood legend. So Rabbit potentially has issues with dyslexia or specific learning difficulties, but he also has anger problems. Particularly in the cartoons, Rabbit is constantly frustrated by what the other members of the gang get up to and the mistakes that they make, and he lets it be known in a socially unacceptable way. So he potentially has anger management problems. And then finally, Piglet, poor little Piglet, who is constantly in a state of agitation and worry, and is always kind of just teetering on the edge of a breakdown because he's so anxious about what might happen. So Piglet we might talk about in terms of anxiety. We could go further. We could talk about Bart Simpson. There's an episode of The Simpsons where Bart's actually diagnosed with ADHD and given medication. Nelson Muntz, who's also from The Symptoms, is a bully, is constantly aggressive towards other people, is extremely antisocial to children and adults. Those are all signs of what some people refer to as conduct disorder or conduct problems. So these are some of the kinds of difficulties that children and young people might experience. Some will experience several of those all at once, some will experience them in a very transient way, but these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. So the more formal definition that's given is of mental health difficulties is changes in our thinking, mood and or our behaviour that impair our functioning. So the impairing of functioning is a very important part to that definition, because lots of children will experience those kinds of problems to a degree, but they're able to cope, so they're able to kind of carry on and it doesn't interfere with their lives. It's the point at which it interferes with their ability to lead the lives that they want to lead that it becomes a mental health problem. Anywhere up to 20% of children and young people are affected, although in England I think the estimate is about 1 in 10, so it's more like 10%. 50% of lifetime cases of mental ill health have their first onset in childhood or adolescence by age 14. So if you're going to experience mental health difficulties in your lifetime, you've a 1 in 2 chance that the first onset of that difficulty is going to occur in childhood or adolescence. And by age 24, 3/4 of lifetime cases of mental ill health have had their first onset. So those early formative years are crucial. We also know from lots of research that there's a significant increase in prevalence between childhood and adolescence. This is where Inside Out comes in. Just put your hand up if you've seen Inside Out. Most people. It's absolutely superb. One of the reasons, other than it being a very entertaining film, is it's a great case study of, you know, one view of what happens to Riley, who's the main character in that film, is it's the onset of a period of depression associated with significant transitions in her life. So major life transitions can trigger periods of mental ill health. So she's ending childhood and beginning adolescence, and that is just beautifully handled, I think, in terms of how the inner characters kind of interact with one another. But she's also facing a major transition because her family uproots her from the Midwest and they move to San Francisco, so she loses all of her social networks, she loses all the sources of support and resilience, and she feels very isolated. And her behaviour in the second half of the film, there are clear signs of her feeling extremely depressed, and in fact Sadness, who's one of the inner characters, does certain things that then mean she decides that she wants to leave home. So Inside Out, I think, should be certainly shown in most child development courses, definitely part of people's mental health training. It's beautifully done, and it's also, to the extent that this kind of film can be, it's also research based. They consulted with all the kind of key researchers on the west coast of the States to make sure that what they're doing wasn't just a fantasy, it actually at some level represents what we know about what happens in the transition to adolescence. What we know also about mental health problems: reduction in quality of life for the people who are affected, lost economic productivity. So if you experience mental health problems, one of the things that happens is people tend not to work, or they're less likely to work because they're less able to. Destabilisation of communities. It's extremely costly. We spend about £105 billion a year in England alone on mental health care. Most of that, unfortunately, on treatment rather than on prevention, which I'll come back to. And there are some very clever analyses, prospective analyses, about how mental ill health and physical ill health affect life trajectories. And one analysis has shown that by 2030, just depression, so not the other range of mental health difficulties, depression alone will yield the highest disease burden in Western civilization in terms of life years lost as a result of a disabling condition. That's more than diabetes, that's more than heart disease, that's more than any physical health condition. Depression alone will be the biggest source of life years lost by 2030. Okay, what about well-being? Well, well-being is used all the time and very poorly understood. It's been described as a slippery and elusive construct. Erat and Whiting are researchers who were commissioned by the Department for Education just under 10 years ago to go and do a discourse analysis, look in all the policy documentation, talk to civil servants, talk to people involved in education. What do we mean by well-being? And the conclusion that they came to is basically what you've got there. It's a cultural construct. It's got a shifting set of meanings. They talked about it having a very holographic quality. Just when you think you get close enough to touch it, it disappears. They found pretty much everybody that they spoke to gave a different definition. And so they said it's no more or less than what a group or group of people collectively agree makes a good life. So it's a bit of a slippery concept, and from the point of view of the kind of research I do, it's very, very difficult to measure, which causes huge problems for the kind of research that I tend to do. Carl, who's unfortunately not here tonight, Carl Emery, who's a PhD student of mine and is now a member of staff here, wrote a book about 4 years ago where they critiqued this idea of whether actually there is a well-being that can be objectively measured, and they very strongly argued that, you know, this idea of an objective list of things that make up well-being, they came to the conclusion it's a road to Rome, we're never going to get there. And then Peter Kinderman, who's a colleague at Liverpool, who's a clinical psychologist, had data looking at, with about 27,000, this is an adult sample, but about 27,000 in the sample, and they had what ostensibly was a measure of well-being and ostensibly was a measure of mental health difficulties, and they said, well, what's the relationship between the two? What they've conclusively shown is it's not just two sides of the same coin. It's not, well-being is not just the opposite of mental ill health. It's much more complex than that. Okay, so on to risk and resilience. So this is where a lot of my work is currently. The one thing to say, if you're not familiar with risk and resilience, which some people in the room will be and some people are not, you'll be familiar with inequality. Most people, the idea of inequality, that based on factors beyond a person's control, they may have more or less access to services, they may be more likely to experience negative outcomes. If you're familiar with inequality, you're already familiar with the idea of risk and resilience, because to me it's the same kind of thing. It's about the fact that based on certain characteristics, we know from the research that some people are more likely to experience mental health difficulties. A key thing in this is this idea of cumulative risk. So there are a whole laundry list of risk factors that have been identified that make an individual more likely to experience mental health problems, but any one in isolation doesn't tell the whole picture, and there's lots of research to back this up. Single risk factors, there's no single cause between a risk factor and a experience of difficulty. But what has been shown in the research, that as these risk factors accumulate, so people, they cluster, and people are, you know, so if you're from a poor background, you're also statistically more likely to be potentially from a particular ethnic group. You're also more likely statistically to, as a child, to also experience special educational needs. They cluster around individuals. They're markers for inequality. And the more of these risk factors that are present in an individual's life, the more likely they are to experience mental ill health. There's a nice little chart. Oh, the chart is on the next slide. What we know about this also, though, is that these operate at multiple ecological levels. So this is coming back to Bronfenbrenner. So some of the risk factors are at the individual level, some are at the familial level, some are in the school context, some are in the community context, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of, it's Bronfenbrenner's model brought to life. But we also know from the study of protective factors that the same parallel exists. So just as we can talk about cumulative risk, we can also talk about cumulative protection, and the idea that even in situations of significant risk and adversity, if children have a sufficient number and multitude of protective factors in their lives, that can actually engender resilience. That can mean that they, despite experiencing significant risk, go on to experience positive outcomes. So it's that idea of kind of tipping the balance, if you like, in terms of protection over risk. So this is my chart. This is significant for two reasons. One is it's a piece of work that I'm involved with at the moment, which is not published yet, so this is kind of debuting this data with you. But also, this took me most of an afternoon to work out how to do in PowerPoint. And eventually I gave up and rang Alex, who's one of our researchers, and said, how do you do this? And she went, there, it's easy. It was trying to get it to animate. It's just really hard if you don't know how to use Excel. So this is data from our, Michael mentioned the Head Start study. There was another study that preceded that. So this is data from essentially the Head Start pilot study. Along the bottom, these are risk factors. So these are markers that we had that were to do with things that we knew from the research made it more likely that a young person would experience mental health problems. So children who are from poorer backgrounds, children who have special educational needs, children from particular ethnic groups, children who rated as having poor or destructive family relationships. And so we sum those. So basically, cumulative risk theory, the idea is the nature of the risk is not what matters, it's the accumulation of risk. And you can see that very, very clearly with this. As the number of risks goes up, this is behaviour problems on the y-axis, the problems shoot up in an exponential manner. But that's not the whole story. What we've also had in this data set was data from the children on what we've called their developmental assets or their protective factors. These are things in their lives which we felt might be protective in situations of risk. So children who rate themselves as feeling connected to school. Okay, that's one example. Children who rate themselves as having high levels of self-esteem. Children who are good problem solvers. Children who feel well supported by their peers. And again, the nature of the protective factors is not what matters here, it's the accumulation of them. So, get rid of the main line. These are the children who report having few or no developmental assets or protective factors, and you can see they're elevated, they're much higher. These are children with a moderate number of protective factors, and these are children who we've termed asset rich. So these are children who, despite in some cases significant exposure to risk, also have lots of protective resources that they can call on in their lives. So they have strong and enduring friendships. They have an adult that they feel cares about them in school. And you can see the moderating effect that has on their behaviour problems. So there's a significant difference between each of these three groups in terms of their mental health difficulties. Where it starts to go awry is at the very high risk end. So for children who have lots of risks in their lives, even if they're asset rich, their outcomes are no different from the children who have less assets. So there's possibly a situation where there is so much risk and adversity that the coping resources are just completely overwhelmed. Okay, so are these kinds of difficulties increasing? So we know there's inequity, okay, in terms of risk. Are these problems increasing? So this is from Murphy and Fonagy, and they talk about this idea that there's a popular perception that mental health difficulties are increasing. So before we look at the data, I want to think about, well, okay, if we think that's the case, why might it be the case? What's happened? What's changed over the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to have caused that shift? And there's a whole range of things. We could go all day looking at this. We could look at social media. We could look at screen time. We could look at changes in patterns of how children spend their time when they're not in school. We could look at a whole range of issues that might underpin changes in children's mental health. So there have been societal changes, even in the last 10 years. You know, we can't connect them. There is no single cause, as I said, but there are certainly some candidates for, if there is evidence of mental health difficulties increasing, they're candidates for being contributory factors. We also know income inequality has continued to rise, and there's research that shows the more income inequality you have in a country, it's inversely related to population estimates of well-being. So we're a particularly unequal or inequitous society, and I'll show you data later on that shows that's reflected in children's well-being. Okay, so what does the data actually show us? Well, it actually shows us that things are pretty stable. So these are all studies that have been published in the last few years. The studies that show up until the late 90s or thereabouts, there were increases in a whole range of difficulties. But in the last few years, actually, for most mental health difficulties, the data suggests that things are pretty stable. Other than, I'm not being particularly subtle in highlighting what I think is a particular trend. So there are three separate studies by Fink, who's a colleague of mine at Cambridge, by War and colleagues, and by Lesov, which was published about 3 weeks ago, that shows that there have been particular increases in mental health difficulties among girls, and particularly adolescent girls. Now, there's a whole range, you know, I'm not even going to pretend to say I know what's underpinning that. I don't. I could speculate and talk about gender socialisation practices. I could speculate and I could talk about changes in our education system, pressures on young women. I could talk about a whole range of things to do with media and body image, but that's not my area, so I'm not going to go there. Other than that, actually, things seem pretty stable. Some people don't like the idea that you can use surveys and other measures to try and get an estimate of mental health difficulties. So if there's anybody like that in the room, this might help. These are not surveys. These are admissions to A&E where self-harm was recorded as the cause. So this is not children filling in a survey, this is a hospital recording a case of significant injury that's known to result from self-harm. And this is the pattern. It's nearly doubled in the last 5 or 6 years. So there is a spike in self-harm represented by this data, but also other data that shows children and young people are more likely than ever now to self-harm. It's still a very small minority of children and young people that engage in self-harm, so these are still tiny numbers relative to the population, but it's impossible to ignore this kind of trend over time. Okay, moving on, other indicators that things may or may not be getting better or worse. So UNICEF do these report cards where they look at child well-being in rich countries. In 2007, the United Kingdom was bottom of 21 rich countries in terms of education, material well-being, health and safety, behaviour and housing and the environment. So utterly, utterly shameful in terms of the national picture that of the 21 richest countries in the world, our children were deemed to fare worst. By 2013, we'd actually moved up, but ultimately that's because they'd broadened the pool of countries that they looked at, and lots of other much more inequitous societies were included. So it's not like things have necessarily got any better, it's just that there are other countries where things are far worse that are now part of this survey. Other things, Good Childhood Report, Children's Society do some annual surveys. We fare very poorly there. One of the key clues for me is in relation to children's reports of their school experience. Children are happier in England in relation to their school experience than almost every other country that the Children's Society surveyed. So children's experience in school is one of the factors that I'm going to come back to. Okay, but there are critical perspectives on this. So there's a piece of work by Myers that came out about 4 years ago that says we really can't talk about changes over time in a non-critical way, because how we think about mental health has changed. How we measure it in terms of these surveys actually hasn't changed that much, but certainly how we think about it has changed. And there's a whole range of things that have happened, actually some things that we ourselves have instigated that might actually lead to a rise. There's 1,000,001 different campaigns around things like Time to Change, the CALM campaign. We are saturated with campaigns to get children and young people and adults to talk more about their mental health problems, to destigmatise it. We want to normalise that process. Well, if we're doing that, if that's successful, that alone could account for the kinds of rises that we've seen. So we've almost, if there have been rises, it's at least in part down to us, the people who are working in this area, and saying this should be destigmatised, this should be normalised. So there's a whole range of things that might underpin any increases that we see, and we do have to kind of take them with a little bit of a pinch of salt when we look at the data. Other things that help kind of, I suppose, get at this issue. Google Trends. I've never used Google Trends before, but I thought I'd use it in relation to this lecture. So we're second only to Australia, countries across the world, in terms of how frequently mental health is Googled. Okay, so only Australia Googles mental health more than us. We're first in the world for Googling self-harm. No wonder there are increases in potentially self-harm. We're obsessed with it as a country, and that's filtering through to children and young people, and of course it's easy to share information about self-harm on the internet. So we top the world, and we're also top of the world for searching for the term mental health crisis. So there's a bit of a societal obsession that might be feeding back into the system. Okay, other examples of how we've become obsessed with mental health. This is data that my colleague Peter Fonagy very kindly provided for me. These are mentions of mental health in UK newspapers. So virtually none in 2008, less than 10 years ago, up to 1,000 last year. There is a very clear upward trend. It's a media obsession. These are mentions of CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. These are the quinquennial rates, so 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015. You can see the trend there. So the media has become obsessed with mental health, in particular mental health services for children and young people. In the late 90s, so just kind of a bit further back here, there were no mentions of child and adolescent mental health services. So child and adolescent mental health services have existed way beyond that time and have been referred to as that, but they were never mentioned in a newspaper until the year 2000. Okay, how and why have they become linked at policy level? This is a very, very rough and sketchy timeline of policy documents, key policy documents. On the top line are some education documents, bottom line key health documents, and middle line is where policy documents kind of bring the two together, where they're written and published for both education and health audiences. This is 2000 to 2010, and what you can see is a little bit of kind of, you know, something happens in the middle and then you get a development in health or a development in education, and they kind of bounce back against one another. So there is an interaction between health policy and education policy over time. Some of the key things to point out there, so this is SEAL, targeting mental health in schools, the children's plan, all of these things that were either focusing on mental health or well-being or constructs related to it. So you see a steady flow of policy from both education, health, and the two combined. Michael Gove appears up there in 2010, and look what happens in relation to education. This is not me, you know, well no, it is me saying how much I despise that particular individual, let's be honest. But, you know, this was genuinely me looking, well, was there anything that was published in the Department for Education before Michael Gove was booted out that could be seen as relating to mental health and well-being? And the answer is there's not. And what you then see, of course, is the interaction, the policies that are bringing both audiences or both areas together is also kind of disappears. What you then get with Nicky Morgan and Sam Gima are some key policies that actually start to shift towards shifting the responsibility for mental health onto schools. Now, I take a very cynical view of this, you know, because one view could be, well, isn't it great that our politicians are finally looking at children's mental health and looking at how schools can play a key role in that? That would be wonderful if that was the case. Actually, what I think it is it's a bit of a PR exercise, and it's also to distract attention from the fact that while all this has been going on over these 5 years, child and adolescent mental health services have been absolutely obliterated. They are amongst the most affected services, public services, that have been affected by the austerity and by all the cuts. So it's, to me, it's a way of distracting attention, saying, well, actually, it's wonderful that schools are involved in all this. It's to get you thinking over here, when over here, they're absolutely obliterating services. Where are we now? Well, we've got a new Secretary of State for Education, so Justine Greening. Who knows what will happen going forward? That's one of the things about the kind of the politician's life cycle. They're usually pretty short. So somebody comes in, does a couple of years, somebody's booted out. Theresa May referenced mental health problems in her inaugural speech as PM. Jeremy Corbyn, when he was elected Labour leader, also spoke about mental health issues. It's at least on politicians' radar. Whether or not some of this interest is genuine or whether it's a bit of a PR exercise, again, is for you to decide. Okay, is there a crisis in children's mental health? These are all headlines. These are a few headlines, literally just a few. I could have done 40 slides with these kinds of headlines. These are all within the last 2 years. Some local, so Manchester's mental health bosses pushed through savage cuts despite public rage. Some of them are about national headlines. This is a particularly interesting one. So this is one of the sources of evidence that I think shows that the government's current kind of interest, if you like, in mental health is a bit of a sham. So the government promised to invest 1.25 billion in mental health services over the next Parliament. Okay, so a year after they made that promise, a Freedom of Information Act request was put in to see, well, where's the money gone? So a year has gone past, so there should have been 250 million spent. Well, first of all, the government retracted and said, actually, no, it's 143 million. Do you know what their reasoning for that was? Basically, they said, in a nutshell, we can't trust people to spend money in the right way, so we're not going to give it all of you. We're not going to give you your pocket money because I know you'll spend it on sweets, was basically the answer. When they digged even deeper, they found actually that money it's just disappeared in a puff of smoke. It's not actually been able to be attributed to any changes in frontline services. And when they've been pressed on that, basically this investment, such as it was not ring-fenced. So it's gone into the NHS, and of course with all sorts of other crises in the NHS to do with, you know, there's not enough beds and there's not, you know, all those other things, and the money's just gone. So the money that was promised for child and adolescent mental health services, they didn't put a fence around it and it's disappeared. Where it has been, people been able to grab it, they've just had to backfill against the savage cuts. So we're no further than we were when the cut started 5 years ago. So is there a crisis? Well, I mean, who knows? It's subjective. I should reference Terry Hanley for this. Terry and I had a conversation at DERA a few weeks ago about this idea of, well, how do you simplify it? Well, on the one hand, you've got need, and potentially need is rising in some areas for some young people. But also you've got to think about provision. So need might be quite stable, but if you cut provision, you can create a crisis. Similarly, if provision stays stable but need rises, again, it's about, ideally you want need and provision to be balanced. Also, the kind of provision matters. So if the provision's there but it's not effective, that can tip the scales in favour of a crisis. So what do we know about what might create a crisis? Well, as I said, there's been major cuts to CAMHS. That, again, is, that's irrefutable. Most CAMHS services have lost anywhere up to, in some areas, 50% of their funding. So that, if they had 10 members of staff, they've now got 5. In some areas, it's even worse. So Young Minds, again, Freedom of Information Acts are brilliant. So you can put these in and they have to release the data. What that's shown is in lots of areas, there have been such savage cuts that they're basically on a skeleton crew, effectively. There's this decade of delay between the first sign of problems and getting help. So this is a piece of research by Khan at the Mental Health Foundation that shows that some young people, it takes 10 years for them to get the help that they need. There's been significant increases in CAMHS referral thresholds. So if you cut statutory CAMHS services, the only way that they can react is to up the threshold for referrals. So if you had to be here 10 years ago, you now have to be up here to get seen. It's literally that simple. And I've talked to lots of CAMHS practitioners. I've been involved in the Future in Mind training pilots, and so I've been up and down the country and talked to CAMHS practitioners and to schools, and they all say the same thing. Children who we would have been able to see 10 years ago or 5 years ago, we're not able to now because the thresholds have had to increase. About a third of children who were referred to CAMHS weren't allocated a service within the same year. The promised investments disappeared. Anybody who's critical, so do people know who Natasha Devon is? If you've seen Sky News, she's quite often on that. She was a spokesperson, so the DFE appointed her as the kind of mental health and education czar until she actually started voicing her opinions and saying, actually, what the government's doing in education and in CAMHS is absolutely disgraceful. And they went, ooh, quick, get rid of it. And they binned her within about 3 weeks for having an opinion. Now, what that's done actually is that's made her much more vocal than ever she was while she was doing that work for the Department for Education. So they've created this kind of monster in terms of somebody who is hypercritical, who's extremely high profile, and is on the news at least once a week talking about how damaging these policies are. But they try and kind of silence these critical voices. So there's the cuts to CAMHS, but there's also this issue in education around accountability. So there's a piece of work by Hutchins that's called Exam Factories that came out about a year ago. That was surveying schools, children and young people, but also teachers about, well, some of the changes that we've seen in the structure of the education system, but also the practices in terms of increased accountability, high stakes testing, all of those things that we intuitively feel can be quite damaging. And they've said to young people, well, what does this mean to you? And the data that they got back from young people and teachers was very, very clear that these changes in education and the increased pressure on children and young people is at least part of what's leading to increases, if there are increases, in mental health difficulties. Sharp has summed that up nicely. I did a paper with a colleague of mine, Chris Burnell, in the British Medical Journal, where we talked about this idea of a zero-sum game. This was during the Gove years, where basically Gove's position and the position of the DFE for those 4 years was anything that you do that's not about improving attainment is necessarily damaging to attainment. So if you spend time on wishy-washy things like well-being and mental health, that's time you could have spent teaching children to read, write, add up and do science. So it's this zero-sum game. If you spend time on one, you're losing time on the other. And that's been part of the pattern as well. What's also come in some of the policy discourse is increasingly the words like grit and character, and basically if only we could make kids tougher is basically the message. They need to man up. That's pretty much what underlies a lot of the DFE discourse around character and grit, is we just need to make tougher children. This is a quote from a primary school teacher. This is just to give you a sense of what some of the teachers in Hutchins' study were saying. A child who's so worried about their SATs test that they're actually physically ill and miss school. This is not unusual. This is one quote from many in Hutchins' report. So why have schools become a central focus? I'm going to run through this quickly because it's 5 to. They're a central focus partly because they have very broad reach. They have a period of prolonged engagement. So one of Rutter's early books was called 15,000 Hours. Children spend that long in compulsory education. Surely we can affect positive change when we've got 15,000 hours of a young person's time. In a lot of communities, they're a central hub. If you go back to Bronfenbrenner, school's the primary developmental context after the family. So, you know, there's a connection there. A colleague of mine, Tamsin Ford, did a piece of work looking at parents of children who experience mental health problems and who've accessed services. One of the questions she asked was, who do you contact when you're worried about your child's mental health? Who do you contact? Teachers are the most commonly contacted professional, above GPs, above other, you know, above anyone else, quite significantly far and above. Parents are most likely to talk to a teacher if they're worried about their child's mental health. We also know from work that Michael's done and work that I've been involved with that children's attainment in school and their mental health are interrelated. This is a piece of work we're doing at the moment. This is data from girls. It looks hideously complex. It's not. Children's reading, 3 years on the trot. Children's emotional problems using the SDQ, if people have heard of that, the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, and children's conduct problems, behaviour problems, 3 years on a trot. So the red arrows represent statistically significant connections between how well they're doing in terms of their attainment and the likelihood of experiencing difficulties a year later, even after controlling for their difficulties a year earlier. So it's controlling for how badly they were feeling a year earlier, and we see significant connections. So girls who are struggling in school are more likely to experience emotional problems when we go back a year later, regardless of how they were feeling at the same time that we first assessed them. Similarly, there's this connection between struggling academically and increased likelihood of experiencing behaviour problems. This is data for girls because our analysis showed that actually the pathways were different for girls and boys. For boys, it's much more, the pathways are stronger. I'm looking at Maggie now to correct me if I'm wrong, who did this analysis, but the data for boys shows a similar pattern, but actually the pathways are much stronger in relation to attainment and behaviour. So, and it works both ways. So children who have behaviour problems here, there's a connection, an inverse connection with their attainment a year later. So behaviour problems erode children's academic progress. And this is also accounted for a whole range of risk factors. So underpinning this model, we'd ruled out the influence of poverty, we'd ruled out the influence of special needs and so on. Okay, I'm going to start skipping through actually because I'm running out of time. So future in mind, this was a key policy, again, one that brings together education and mental health services that the government launched just over a year ago. One of the things, so I was involved through the work I do with the Anna Freud Centre and some of the trainings around this. So we worked with schools and CAMS services up and down the country. Just a little anecdote that I think sums up how difficult this situation has become. The whole idea of these pilots that were run, these cascade pilots as they were called, was you get a room like this, not a lecture theatre, but a room with lots of professionals in, and you get schools and you get CAMS services and educational psychology services and kind of third sector services. You get them in the room so that they can talk to one another. And actually, one of the things we found was in some areas, people were saying, this is the first time we've ever actually met this person from CAMS or we've met this person from this school. But what we found in some areas was we'd start the introductions to the day and we'd go around and say, where are you and who, what school are you from or what service are you from? In a couple of areas, we're going around the room and my co-trainer Melanie Jones, who's a clinical psychologist who's doing this with me, and we're going around the room and I'm nudging her going, there's nobody from CAMS here. There's absolutely no, and we got round the room and there was nobody, in two areas, there was nobody from CAMS at all. So immediately then a pilot that's about bringing schools and CAMS together falls pretty much flat on its face in an area where, so we then followed this up because we were quite, you know, I was like, this is going to be an absolute disaster, and actually both of those days were a bit of a disaster. So we followed it up. And of course, what we got back from the CCG, from the Clinical Commissioning Group, is they contacted the CAMHS service. It wasn't they didn't want to come, but they were on a skeleton crew, and it was they had a choice to make between, well, we can send the CAMHS practitioner along to this pilot training day, or they can actually see some kids. And they prioritised, quite rightly in some senses, they were good because they had such a backlog, and they are under this constant pressure to be working with young people. So in some ways, the proposed solution is disabled by some of the cuts that have come earlier. Okay, to finish on, is evidence-based practice the answer? There is a slightly lazy trope in the literature that basically says something along the lines of, if only we all used evidence-based practices, everything would be okay. And that's implicit. You go to a lot of the conferences I go to, that's pretty much the conclusion of most of the presentations. If only we all use these RCT proven programs, the world will be a better place. I'm a bit of a critical insider in this, in that I do RCTs and those kinds of research designs that are part of the evidence-based practice movement, but I also recognise, I suppose, some of the limitations. The first thing is to say is evidence-based practice is not just about RCT evidence. That's a misnomer from the anti-EBPU movement. Evidence-based practice, Sackett calls it the three-legged stool. It's about evidence, but it's also about clinical expertise, or the expertise of the teacher or whoever is the person who's responsible for intervening, and it's also about client preference. So it's also about what the young person wants. So the RCTs that show that something does or doesn't work, if that's the way you interpret it, are only 1/3 of the picture. This evidence hierarchy is applied. Basically, the further up you go, the more rigorous, in inverted commas, the evidence is. And so only randomised trials and meta-analyses of randomised trials get a look in. Those are the things that prove what we should be doing. If only it were that simple. So there's a few elephants in the room. The first of these is the 30 most common difficulties that are experienced by children who see a child mental health specialist. So there's been research done on this by my colleague Miranda Walp at the Anna Freud Centre. So the 30 most commonly seen difficulties among children and young people. There's only NICE guidance. So National Institute of Health and Care Excellence produce guidance when they feel there's sufficient evidence to produce guidance. Guidance only exists for 13 of the most 30. So for nearly 2/3 of the most common difficulties where children see a specialist, we don't have the evidence base in order to say what we think is going to be most effective. So immediately, that's hugely problematic if we're saying we should all be doing evidence-based practice. For some kinds of difficulties, the evidence just doesn't exist. We also know from research by Warren that even if children are in receipt of, actually I think this is adults, where they're in receipt of an evidence-based intervention, one that's had multiple randomised trials to show it to be effective, 1 in 3 of them will continue to experience difficulties or will actually get worse. So it's not this idea, people go, oh, well, if an RCT has proven it to work, it cures people. It doesn't. People who've participated in things like cognitive behavioural therapy, which has got a strong evidence base behind it, still about 1 in 3 of them won't get any better, even though it's an evidence-based practice. So again, there's a hole there. There's this brilliant, I think, piece of research by Garolanda and colleagues that came out about a month or 2 ago. They were interested in what's the evidence for evidence-based practice. So they did a systematic review. This is kind of getting to like Inception level, dream within a dream within a dream. So they did this meta-analysis looking at, well, are there studies that look at if you implement evidence-based guidelines, do you actually get better outcomes? And what they found was that only a minority of studies showed a positive effect, and actually some studies showed a negative effect. So when they trialled the implementation of evidence-based guidelines for mental health, in some cases it actually made people feel worse. So it's by no means the answer. In terms of schools, well, we know from research that schools rarely change what they do on the basis of research, let alone randomised trials. We did a big piece of research about 3 years ago, and only 1/3 of schools, one of the things we asked schools in this big survey was, how do you decide what interventions you're going to use? Only about 1/3 of them actually mentioned research evidence of any kind. So not just RCTs, anything that you might define as research. The lag between evidence and actually routine practice can be anywhere up to 20 years. Michael and Anne have done a meta-analysis, a brilliant piece of work that came out earlier this year that looked at a whole range of other things that might be important. So they looked at whether the developers involved in the trial If a developer is involved in a trial, in other disciplines in psychiatry, the effect sizes, the amount of change that you see is 5 times what it is if it's an independent trial. Now that's actually not what Michael and Anne, correct me if I'm wrong, found in relation to social emotional learning interventions, which is our area of interest, but also stage of evaluation counts. So there's this distinction between an efficacy trial, where we tightly control things, we support implementation, we make it as, you know, it's a well-supported intervention, and an effectiveness trial where we say it's more like the real world, let them get on with it. So there's that distinction between those two types of trials. So this is an example of the change that you see in outcomes. So this is academic achievement in social and emotional learning interventions. The effect size nearly halves when you actually test it in real world conditions. So there's a problem of expectation management and what schools are promised when they take on these so-called evidence-based interventions. This is social and emotional competence outcomes. These are interventions that have been delivered in their country of origin, and these interventions that have been exported. We import lots of these evidence-based interventions in mental health and in schools. We bring lots in from America and from other areas. For this particular outcome, for this particular group of interventions, you can see the stark difference. And then finally, it's not enough to just have whatever the evidence-based intervention is. You've actually got to deliver it well. And this is data that we published from our study of SEAL, where we'd looked at a range of schools and we'd assessed the quality of the implementation. So some schools doing it very poorly, some schools doing an okay job, and some schools doing really well. And you can see this is conduct problems, so this line getting lower means less conduct problems, and you can see the very clear pattern. Implementation quality really makes a substantial difference to outcomes. So it's not enough just to have the intervention, you've got to deliver it well. And that's not necessarily delivering it with fidelity in inverted commas. Finally, very finally, because I know I'm out of time and I've kept you a long time, is this just a child panic? So I presented you with evidence that I think supports the idea that there actually is a crisis of sorts going on in child and adolescent mental health, but there is a sector of the academic community and probably wider society that says this is really just a child panic. This is an example of which we have other historical examples of the adult population getting extremely concerned and het up about something that actually really isn't. It's something that we've created ourselves. And Catherine Eccleston, who's a colleague of mine at Sheffield, is one of the key proponents of this and says what we've seen over the last 15 years is not a rise in difficulties, it's not those kinds of things I've been talking about, it's the fact that we've changed the way that we think about childhood and that we think about young people, and that really we've become extremely pessimistic about children's agency, and the idea that we're in crisis is not supported. Some of the possible evidence to support that, a lot of the work that's published in this area is a little bit absent of evidence, I have to say, but where there is evidence is you can go back historically, and I said I'd talk about penny dreadfuls, you can go back to almost any point in recorded history and you can actually find evidence of other child panics. So this is not necessarily saying what we're experiencing now is a child panic, but there have certainly been other ones. So penny dreadfuls were these little horror comics that were produced in Victorian England that were full of blood and guts and, you know, all kinds of nasty things. So you can imagine kids loved them, absolutely lapped them up. And there was this panic at the time in the late 1890s about this is absolutely destroying children. So this is a news report about how this penny dreadful epidemic was causing children to commit suicide. There are other examples. If you go back to the 1980s when I was a child, it was video nasties. So horror films, and we banned anything with gore because it's so horrific. There was a panic about rock and roll records. If you played them backwards, you heard satanic messages, and children, you know, blew their heads off with shotguns because they'd heard Satan talking to them, and it blew up into this huge panic. There was in America there was a child panic around satanic ritual abuse, which actually then it turned out there was absolutely no evidence for whatsoever. Go back to World War II and there was a panic, or just post World War II, there was a huge panic about the number of children and young people who had been left fatherless by the war, and that this was going to destroy a generation because so much of that generation were going to grow up without knowing their father. These panics do happen over time. Cohen who wrote from a kind of sociological perspective, talked about this idea of folk devils. So whenever there's a moral panic, there are always these folk devils that are we pin to the wall and say, this is the cause. You know, if this is a moral panic, we could be thinking about the things I mentioned earlier, increased screen time, social media, all those kinds of things that I mentioned as being the modern day folk devils in this child panic. Stitch also talks about how these, what he calls unfounded ideas, become truths, become assumed truths. He talks about the idea that we delude ourselves, that we convince ourselves that there's a panic, we become extremely anxious about it, and then we're not in a good place to make clear decisions, so we start to ignore evidence, or we start to make decisions where there is no evidence to support what we're doing. Okay, I'm going to finish now, I promise. Final thoughts. There is, I think, sleight of hand going on in relation to policy and what's happening in relation to the connection between education and mental health. The only thing I can liken it to is, have people seen Three Card Monty? Not Three Card Monty, what's it called, where they follow the card on the street magicians do it, where they put the card under the cup and you've got to follow it. Say again? Find the lady, thank you. I think that's what's going on. So look over here, and then it's moved. And that's what's happening with child mental health. So while we're making all these cuts to CAMHS, we'll get your focus on education. If things start going wrong in education, we'll bring your focus back to somewhere else. They want the public's attention and the education and the health sector's attention away from where the damage is being done. One thing we can do about this, and I've been very careful not to say here's what we should do because I don't have the answers, is to reframe this idea of a crisis, to think of it as a turning point. So one definition of crisis is it's a time of unprecedented danger. But another definition of crisis is that it's a turning point in a difficult situation. And I think that's where we are right now. As an example of what we might do, I was at an event this morning in Salford where they were part of the Future in Mind pilot. They've not had access to significant additional resources. What Salford have done and are continuing to do, as one example, is they're making more effective use of what they've got. So they're not saying we need billions of pounds of investment. We know that's not going to happen. So they focused inward and said, well, how can we make better use of the resources that we have? And they're doing exceptional work in terms of connecting schools and CAMHS together, in terms of making schools and other services aware of what's out there. There's lots of stuff out there in terms of voluntary and community sector organisations that can help. But schools quite often just don't know they exist and they're 2 miles down the road. So Salford have created a local directory of services that they're then giving to all schools so that they know there's this charity down the road that does counselling work, or they know that there's this organisation that does another type of intervention work. So they're making better use of what they have. We need to revisit Future in Mind again and again and again. So the fact that the government has pinned its flag to the mast, as it were, in saying this is important for us, is helpful now in that we can hold them to account and go back again and again and again and say these commitments were made in Future in Mind about earlier identification, more resources for prevention and so on. It's our responsibility as concerned educators and academics and mental health professionals to be constantly lobbying for the evidence that that's actually being realised in changes. I'm going to leave it there. I just want to give you a couple of these headlines. Just again, there are millions of these out there at the moment. This is an unprecedented time in which attention is being paid to mental health. At the very least, that gives us the opportunity to kind of focus resources and do something about what seems to be happening. Thank you very much.